chapter 3. The book of Esther, chapter 3, reading from verse 1. Esther chapter 3, verse 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordechai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Verse 5. And when Haman saw that Mordechai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordechai alone, for they had shown him the people of Mordechai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordechai. And that's all our reading for tonight, and we trust the Lord will bless the reading of the word and all the other verses that will be referred to in the course of the meeting. We have noticed that chapter 1 gave us a look at 6 months into the life of the king, showing him to be a totally selfish character, because life for him was all about himself. In chapter 2 gave us a look into 12 months into the life of Esther, revealing her and showing us a person who was totally selfless. It was not about herself, it was about others. Coming to chapter 3. Chapter 3 gives us a look at one eventful but significant day, just one day in the life of Mordechai, showing us a man who was totally uncompromising. For him it was all about God and God's honor. Chapter 2 concluded with Esther being promoted to Queen of Persia, and Mordechai saving the king's life. And that good deed of Mordechai was written up and recorded in the chronicles of the empire. Typically, Persian kings were usually good at rewarding good deeds immediately and loyalty immediately, especially in this case where the king's life was spared. So we would expect Mordecai to be rewarded immediately and possibly be promoted in this chapter. And so this chapter starts in verse 1. Chapter 3 verse 1 hints at it. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote. But instead of Mordecai, we are introduced to a totally new and different character. Haman, the one who was promoted by the king. So this chapter is mostly about Haman and his reaction and his attitude towards Mordecai and Mordecai's people, the Jews. It's about his apparent victory and success over Mordecai and his people. He seemed to be in total control from the beginning and the end, but that's not the whole story. Because a greater story is being played out. A greater control is seen over that of Haman and the king, that of the control of the God of heaven and earth. So chapter 3 is going to tell us three things about this man Haman. It's going to tell us about his promotion, about his plan, and about his publication. In verses 1 to 6, it will tell us about his promotion. We know that he'd been promoted. But during his promotion, he encountered a massive problem. And then in verses 7 to 11, he had to devise a plan to overcome, to solve this problem. So in verse 1 to 6, we have his promotion. In verse 7 to 11, we have his plan. And then, for that plan to work, it had to be published. It had to be put into a decree, written into law. And therefore, the last section, verse 12 to 15, we have the publication of Haman. So verses 1 to 6, Haman's promotion. Despite being promoted to second in command in the kingdom, he encountered a huge problem. And that huge problem was little, insignificant, and lowly Mordechai. That was his problem. Verse 1 starts with the words, after these things. What things? After Esther had become queen of Persia, after Mordecai had saved the king's life, after these things, there arose a prominent man named Haman, whom the king exalted over all the princes in all the provinces. In verse 1, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, and it says, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. In this great empire, this was a very high and exalted position. But you know, most people, not all people, but most people, once they are given promotion in life, once they are given authority, once they receive higher honors, they change. Their true colors shone through. And so we see, when Haman was promoted, we see the real Haman. His true colors shine through. And we find him to be, when he was promoted, we find him to be unsatisfied. He was an unsatisfied man because of the fact that he was self-absorbed and self-centered. It was all about himself. He had a very high, in fact, a too high opinion of himself. We learn that in chapter 5, verse 11, and I read that. And Haman told them, his family, of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. It's so easy, even for us, to become consumed with ourselves, consumed with our own achievements, what we've achieved in life, our possessions, our status, our jobs, and so on. Haman soon discovered that things will never bring satisfaction. So we find here a dissatisfied man in spite of his promotion. Not only was he unsatisfied, not only was he unsatisfied, but we will discover that he was dissatisfied as well. He was dissatisfied with a person, and he was dissatisfied with a people. He was second to the king, but he was raging about one man, one solitary, lonely man that would not bow to him and wouldn't honor him. Listen to what he says in chapter 5, verse 13. He speaks of all the things that he achieved. He says, yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordechai the Jew sitting. And for that, he was bent on killing and destroying Mordechai. It was bad enough to destroy a man to satisfy your own ego. However so great was his ego and his dissatisfaction, and his cruelty, that he determined to exterminate a whole race of hardworking and law-abiding people. Mordechai had to die according to him, but so must all the people of Mordechai as well. He was unsatisfied. He was dissatisfied. But you'll find this man was also self-satisfied. He was gloating at the end of chapter 3. At the end of chapter 3, we find him rejoicing at others' expense. While the Jews and the city were perplexed and panicked, this man was sitting back, enjoying his achievement and what he has done, the evil that he has committed. He sat down and drank. He gloated. Unsatisfied and dissatisfied and now self-satisfied. My brother and sister, there's nothing wrong with success in study and success at work. In fact, Scripture puts a high value on hard work. Scripture encourages us to be good citizens and good workers and good students. The issue is with how it is achieved and how it is handled. Success should always be achieved with integrity, and it should be possessed with humility. Chapter 3 really is about the problems then between Haman and Mordechai, who refused to bow before him. Now we know Mordechai. We've been introduced to Mordechai in chapter 2, verse 5 and 6 and 7. But who's this man? Who is Haman? Where does he come from? He is suddenly introduced into the record here. What was behind the immediate bitterness between these two? Well, Haman's ancestry might just give us some clues. Verse 1 says, he was an Agagite. Haman was an Agagite. What is an Agagite? We need to do a little deep digging and go back a little in time. He was, as an Agagite, he was the descendant of King Agag, king of Amalek. For that I want you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul was given a command by God. And in verse 2, this is what the Lord says. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Saul obeyed, but not fully. So in verse 9 we read, but Saul and the people spared Agag. They spared Agag. Because of Saul's failure, the kingdom was taken away from him and it was given to another. Isn't it interesting, my brother and sister, that Mordechai was a descendant of King Saul and Haman was a descendant of King Agag. So you can see why there's an immediate bitterness there. But why was Amalek to be destroyed? Why was it such a bad enemy? Because they were not the only enemy. What exactly did they do to deserve this? If we go further back in time, we'll discover this is the most ancient of Israel's family enemies. It was one of the first enemies, and it was one of the worst enemies. They are specifically cursed in the law. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and 17 says this about Amalek. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye come out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way, and smote the highmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint. This was a coward enemy. It attacked the weak ones, the faint ones, the sick ones, the ones who could not defend themselves. And then in verse 19, the curse goes on. Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. That's why Amalek had to be destroyed by Saul. If you go back further in time, you will discover that Amalek was the grandson of Esau. In Romans chapter 9, God says to Paul, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And throughout the Bible, Amalek is portrayed as the enemy that opposed everything that was of God. Amalek was there right at the beginning as they traveled through the wilderness, attacking the people of Israel. Amalek was in the land, in the promised land, further opposing Israel. Amalek is now in exile in chapter 3 through Haman, still opposing Israel. Amalek is still with us today. Still with us today. You see the believer's difficulty in this world. It's simply a duplication of the activities and the actions and the attitude of an Amalek. Amalek is always present in the life of the believer, opposing everything that is spiritual. You know what the New Testament calls Amalek? The flesh. The flesh. Galatians 5 and 17. This is what Paul says. For the flesh lusted against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other. It's bigger than Haman and Mordechai. It's higher than Haman and Mordechai. There's within every believer that which is inherently displeasing to God. It doesn't matter how refined it might seem to us and appear to us. It can never please God. And God has sworn enmity against the flesh. But you will find, in addition to the ever-present Amalek within us, outside of us, Haman is never absent. There's a Haman out there, and he lives for one purpose only, and that is to exalt himself, and that is to expose everything that is of God, everything that is spiritual. My brother and sister, wherever you live, wherever you work, wherever you study, there's a Haman. There's a Haman. One who exalts himself, one who wants you to bow to him, one who ever seeks status and position in the eyes of others. Have you recognized him in your life? Now, in light of Haman's promotion and Haman's character, verse 2 reveals Mordecai's absolute strength of character and conviction. Think of who Haman was and the hatred Haman had towards Mordecai. Listen to verse 2. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence. Everyone bowed except for Mordecai. And so the tension in the story is beginning to rise. But this conflict goes back much further and much deeper than the current events that we see in chapter 3. The ancestry of Mordecai in chapter 2 verse 5 identifies him as a Benjaminite. And it's important to understand that. But to understand that so that we can understand the conflict between the two of them. This was an ongoing and ancient conflict, a struggle between the King Saul and the King Agag, between the Benjaminite and the Agagite. And because of that, we see the theme of obedience and disobedience as a strong undercurrent in this chapter, in this book. The mention of Mordecai being a descendant of Saul in chapter 2 should not be overlooked in light of the arch enemy, Haman, working against Mordecai. It highlights the importance of obedience and the consequences of disobedience. Remember, contrary to the command, Saul was disobedient to God and he spared Agag. And this is what Samuel said to him. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Why is obedience so important? Because obedience will affect, disobedience will affect you. How did it affect Saul? He lost the kingdom. He lost the throne. Obedience or disobedience is important. Obedience is important because disobedience will affect others. Yet Esther and Mordechai and the people of God were suffering 600 years on. It will affect the people of God. Here they are in the hands of Haman, about to be destroyed. In relation to Mordechai, we again notice the strong theme of obedience and disobedience. While Mordechai took a huge risk, disobeying the king and disobeying Haman, disobeying God would have had and could have had greater consequences. Because of Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman, Haman took determined action to eliminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire. That was an irony because Haman was not even supposed to live. Saul was told to wipe out all the Amalekites, slay both man and woman. But Saul miserably failed in wiping out the memory of Amalek. The irony, however, is even greater here. Because our gracious God, this merciful God, would give Mordecai, the descendant of Saul, who disobeyed, who failed, God has given this man, in all his grace, a second chance for redemption. Maybe you failed in some areas of your life. Whether it's assembly related and family related, whether it is work related or personal, He's the God of a second chance. Peter had a second chance. Many others have their second chance. God gives us wonderful opportunities to do what is right. Oh, may we respond like this man Mordechai by standing for God and to refuse to bow to anything and anyone else. But this power struggle between Haman and Mordechai also played out throughout history on a much higher level, a much higher scale, a spiritual level between God and Satan. At no time in history is this more evident than at the cross. There we witness how Satan encouraged all of humanity to stand up and to work against the Holy One of God. He was innocent. He was without sin. He was sinless and harmless. And yet they collectively called for his crucifixion. How would God respond? Oh, God took the wrath and the hatred of men and used it for his own glory. Listen to the words of the psalmist, Psalm 73 and 10. Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee. And from Calvary, and as a result of Calvary, came the greatest praise and worship from the people of God for almost 2,000 years. But more than just for worship, Calvary was used by God to provide a way of salvation for the very ones who put him there on the cross. What a great example, of God accomplishing his eternal purposes while Satan and man worked against the very purposes of God. God always has the final word, and he used their hatred and their actions for his own glory. He's done it over and over and over again in the book of Esther. My brother and sister, he's still doing it in our day. In verse 3, then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Mordechai was asked for the reason for his stand, for his refusal to bow. And verse 4 indicates they asked him daily, but he refused to bow. So in verse 4, it says, Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, he hearkened not unto them. They told Haman. To test this man's convictions, they told the very man. One thing that stands out about this passage, and you will face it as well, is that your convictions will be tested. The stronger your convictions, the stronger will be the test. The stronger your convictions, the greater will be the attacks. Mordechai refused to bow, and the reason for his refusal lies in both his history and his nationality. Haman was an Amalekite, and God was clear as to the attitude of the Jew towards the Amalekite. Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. This refusal resulted in the conflict that became the very basis of the entire story. So why did he refuse? Why didn't he bow? The answer and the reason is the end of verse 4. For he told them that he was a Jew. The reason for refusal to bow was a spiritual one. He was a Jew. Now Mordechai is the first man in the Bible to be called a Jew. The very first one. And once he's introduced in chapter 2 verse 5, it says, In Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew called Mordechai. From the moment the Jew is introduced, his people, the Jews, are identified and named in almost every single chapter that follows. That proves to me that Esther, the story is more than just about Esther and Mordechai. Esther and Mordecai were used of God for the benefit of the people. It was about the Jews, and that's confirmed for us in chapter 4 verse 14. Mordecai said to Esther, For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. This, and the fact that Haman determined to kill all the Jews in verse 6, so that this refusal to bow was based on his religion and based on his nationality as a Jew and his obedience to God. That explains the strength of Mordecai's conviction. He's a worthy example to follow. From him we learn the importance of standing for God regardless of opposition and the great forces that are brought against us. Many have stood with equal force in the face of opposition. Remember Daniel? He refused to eat the king's food. He refused to stop praying, though it meant the lion's den. Daniel's three friends, they refused to eat the king's to bow to the image of the king, though it meant the fiery furnace. Joseph in Genesis refused to commit adultery, though it meant the prison. In the New Testament, Paul stood, though it meant imprisonment and beatings. Stephen stood, though it meant martyrdom. Peter and John, they continued to preach the gospel. They refused to stop preaching the gospel, although it meant beatings and imprisonment. When it counted, these men all stood for God. What do we know about suffering for the name of God? Suffering for our convictions. Suffering for the stand we take. That was Mordecai. In verse 5, And when Mordecai saw, or Haman saw, that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then was Haman full of wrath. Now, it's always easier to start making a stand for God than to continue in the face of opposition and oppression. Mordechai was not naive when he started to take a stand. And now that it comes to the real test of his conviction, he continued to stand. He knew exactly the risk he was taking by his stand, but he had the courage of conviction. It reminds me of Martin Luther. When he stood up to his superiors, he said, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. Help me, God." How far are you prepared to go for your convictions? How much are you prepared to suffer for the people of God and for others? Oh, may we display a similar courage when we are called upon to stand for God. And again, the tension in the narrative is rising higher and higher as it reaches its climax, its evil climax, in verse 6. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shown him the people of Mordecai. As a result of Mordecai's refusal, Haman determined to destroy all the Jews. Now, he could have killed him instantly, but he was told that Mordecai was a Jew, and it's because of his religion and his nationality that he refused to bow. So rather than killing him alone, he was going to kill and destroy all the Jews in the empire. Haman has decided, in order to do more damage, he will hurt Mordecai where it hurt most. And so he went after the people of Mordecai. He went after the people of God. He knew Mordecai had a soft spot for the people of God. Despite all the problems of the people, despite the people's shortcomings, he still loved the people. How do you feel about the people of God? Are you prepared to make sacrifices for them? These are challenging questions. This is not the first time that we see a Satan-inspired hatred toward the Jews. It started in Exodus when Pharaoh tried to kill all the male babes to exterminate the Jews. And then we have Haman trying to do the same thing here. He was followed by Herod in Matthew chapter 2, trying to kill all the male babes under the age of 2. In recent days, it was Hitler. But very recently, Persia, this Persian empire, today it is called Iran. They made a decision. They vowed to wipe Israel off the map of the world. This is surely Haman under a different name. His legacy still lives on, and it will continue to live on until the Lord will come and make an end and bring a final end to it. Because they were God's people, Haman were raging against them, and he invented a terrible plan to exterminate them. And that is what is covered, Haman's plan in verses 7 to 11. To accomplish the plan, he had the lot cast to determine the time and the day to destroy the Jews. We read that in verse 7. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year, and so on. He says from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. The superstitious use of the lot had always been prevalent and quite common in Persia. This practice is similar to the tossing of, the rolling of a dice and the tossing of the coin. It was believed that the gods would turn out, make the lot to turn out to show what is real and what is true and what is best. This was really an appeal to the false gods, to astrology, to so-called magic. The word lot means pearl. In the middle of verse 7 we read, they cast pearl, that is the lot. And the name of the Jewish festival in Esther is based on this. It's called Purim. based on the law. The result was that the 12th month was chosen for the Jews to be killed. Even this was outside the control of Haman. And it just shows again that in everything, in every move, in every action, God was watching over His people and God was caring for His people. My brother and sister, we may suffer and we may be tried in this world, but the final result will be for our good. The false gods cannot defeat the purposes of God. Astrology is worthless. Appeals to supernatural sources are inferior. If you want the truth, we don't consult the stars and astrology and the papers. No, we go to God and His Word. And so when we come to verse 8, Haman said unto the king, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces in thy kingdom. Their laws are diverse from all the people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. And stating half-truths, he persuaded the king for his own benefit to get rid of this people. Why did they hate them so much? In his plan to wipe out this people, he exposed himself and gave the real reasons. He accused them in verse 8 for the fact that their laws were diverse from all the people. He says they are different. Why were they different? They followed God's laws. Neither keep they the king's laws. They live by a different law and a different principle. They are not profitable to you, he said to the king, but they were. Because Mordechai saved the king's life. And these were law-abiding citizens. But if you think what he said, they live by a different law. They have their own way of thinking. They follow God. Wow, this came from the fiercest enemy of the Jews. What a compliment. What a testimony to the faithfulness of the people of God in a pagan environment. How would the unbelievers and the world describe us today? As a people living by different rules, different principles, a different way of living. Notice how he doesn't identify the Jews. He says there's a certain people. He was smart enough not to give the king all the details and any specifics. And the king was foolish enough not to ask any questions. If he asked, he would have discovered that these people were good people, law-abiding people. And the man in the middle of it, in the center of it, is the man who saved him from a sure assassination. You see, the story of the Jews is the story of God working among men. In the nation's history, the Jewish history, we see unquestioned evidences of God's ways and God's will and God being at work. What in our lives has given evidence that God is at work? What is it that the world observes that reminds them and shows them something about God? I tell you what they should see. Paul writes in Galatians 5 and 22, but the fruit of the Spirit, again, against the flesh. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Satan will try to convince you that to be successful in the world, you need to get ahead in life. You need to claim your rights. You need to be in control. You do not allow others to trample on you. God says no. That's not how it works. The opposite is needed to achieve what is important in this life and in our life to come. In verse 9, if it please the king, he says, let it be written that they may be destroyed. That's the Jews. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. That is 375 tons of silver. This is nothing short of bribery, so common in the governments of the world today. But the killing of thousands of people from one race is the grossest kind of evil. Today we call it genocide. Up to this point in time, Haman hasn't even identified the people. Nevertheless, he was granted permission to do what he wanted to do. So on verse 10, the king confirmed this. The king approved it by giving him his ring. That's the official seal by which laws are decreed and authorized. It is a symbol of power and authority. But who was it given to? At the said here, it's given to Haman, the Jews' enemy. The one thing that's clear about this story is that Haman has an absolute hatred toward the Jews. If Mordechai in verse 4 is introduced as the lover of the Jews, here this man is introduced as the enemy of the Jews. On 3 other occasions, chapter 7 verse 6, Esther describes him as the adversary and enemy. In chapter 9, when they describe his family, they are described as the enemy of the Jews. And also in chapter 9, finally, on his way out of the story, on his way out of life, he's called the enemy of all the Jews. Verse 11 says, and the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee. The people also do to them as it seemeth good to thee. Haman's plan was coming together. He got what he wanted, but to guarantee this execution of the Jews, this plan needed to be passed into law, which means it had to be publicized. And so when we come to the last part, verse 12 to 15, we see Haman's publication. Having received the authority, he acted without delay. He published the decree on behalf of the king, in the king's name, and sent out through all the empire. And verse 12 tells us about that action, how it was given to the lieutenants and the governors, and to every province and so on and so on. The decree was published for every single province, to every people in their own language. This was a huge undertaking, and it's fittingly one of the longest verses in the Bible. In fact, it is the 8th longest verse in the Bible, covering a huge operation. But once the law was recorded and sealed, it was unalterable, because it was a law of the Medes and the Persians. Not even the king could undo what had been decreed. But then we've already noticed the other day, there was a higher law at play. The law of heaven, the law of God, who will very soon change this unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians, and he will make it null and void. This was published, according to the record, on the first day or the first month of the year. It was to be executed. The plan was for the last month, for the 12th month of the year. This was determined by lot, remember? But God's hand is seen all over it, because it gave Esther ample time to do what was necessary to save the Jews. If only Haman knew some of the sayings of the Jews, some of the scriptures, it would have stopped him in his tracks. Because Proverbs 16 and 33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. He is still in control. And here, as in everywhere in the book, God is seen directing and controlling the narrative and the story. God is in control. In verse 13 and 14, the decree was ordered to all the inhabitants of the empire to destroy and slay and kill all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. That's in verse 13. In one day this had to be done. What a day that would be. And then afterwards they had authority to plunder their possessions. This idea, this decision was made by one man, Haman. But it affected so many. In verse 10 it affected the king. In verse 12 it affected the scribes and the lieutenants and the governors and the rulers of every province. And now, in verse 13 and 14, it involved and affected all the people of the empire. They are all drawn into this murderous plot. Verse 14 says, unto all the people that they should be ready against that day. Oh, how little this world had changed. People today would go along with the worst of evils without questioning, without even raising an eyebrow. Just as disobedience and wrong decisions affect others, their wrong decisions here affected others, so many, so will mine and yours. How we act out our decisions and how we act out our intentions will affect and touch the lives of everyone that you have to do with. Haman's decisions and acts affected everyone in the empire. And ours will likewise affect everyone in the empire of our lives, within the family, at work, in the assembly. It will either affect them for good or for bad. And that's why the hymn writer says, Christian, walk carefully. Danger is near. The last verse. The posts, that is the publication, went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. The king he invited Haman to drink and to probably congratulate him on the great work that he accomplished and on his cleverness. But the verse says, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. They panicked. The decrees and the decisions, they were all published, but the publication perplexed all in Shushan, the city. The whole city was thrown into confusion. This was the home of many Jews. And they became part and parcel, according to secular history, became part and parcel of society. Yes, they stood apart when it comes to religion, but they were united with society in terms of trade and business and economy. Haman's plans would have shocked all the Jews and the Gentiles in the city, where everybody was getting along very well. So here's Haman, celebrating and drinking and rejoicing in what he accomplished. All he could think of was his own success. But he's forgotten something. The Jews that's about to die, or the Jews are about to die, but he's overlooked the one, the unseen one, who is alive and who was aware of the circumstances. The king in verse 11 offered the people to Haman. He says, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Well, they weren't his to give away. They were God's people. God might have been silent, and God was hidden, and God is ignored, is not named, but he can never be ignored. Soon he will find that he was a real fool to forget the God of the Jews. My brother and sister, no matter how we are treated in this world, and by the people of this world, we are safe in the hands of God. No threat will ever stand to destroy God's people. Not even death itself could harm us. God will have the last say, and it will be in our favor. As we close, over the last few years, there have been many conversions in Iran. Many people got saved. But many of them, and most of them, faced imprisonment and death. Because in Iran, that's modern Persia, there's always a Haman. There's always a Haman. One of the church leaders, identified as Wahid, it tells of him being followed and his phone being tapped and about receiving threatening calls. And together with many other believers, he was arrested and placed in an overcrowded prison with unhealthy and inadequate sanitary facilities. But they continue to stand. They refuse to bow, because although there's a Haman in Iran today, there's still Mordechais who stand for God. This man Wahid was eventually forced out of Iran, but the churches continue to grow. According to the organization Open Doors, that support persecuted Christians in the world, they said, just recently, more Iranians have become Christians over the last 20 years than in the last 13 centuries put together. God is always at work, especially during difficult circumstances. So my brother and sister, don't fret when you face persecution and opposition. Our God works best in such circumstances, especially if we prepare to risk all and stand for God. Tonight we've looked at three things. We've looked at Haman's promotion, but we found that Haman's promotion was only temporary. God will promote us to glory, and our promotion will be glorious and eternal. That is true promotion. We've looked at Haman's plan, but it came to nothing if you study the book. Haman's plan eventually backfired. God has plans for our eventual and our ultimate and our full salvation. Haman's publication was written by men. It was overruled by God. Our future rewards and our future in general is published in the word of truth. It can never be overruled because it is written by God Himself. Oh, what reason we have tonight to stand for God like a Mordechai in spite of the Hamans outside and the Amalek inside. May God bless you.